Hello and welcome to the I Hit Drums podcast with me, Mark, your teacher for this series. We're going to continue working through the book Intermediate 1, which you can find on my website, www.ihitdrums.co.uk. Last week we started looking at some 16th note hi-hat grooves and also some 4-to-the-floor disco grooves. I'd love to know how you're getting on with those, so if you want to, you can put an unlisted video on YouTube, send me a link either through my Instagram or through my YouTube, and I'll take a look. To begin with today though, we're going to start adding open hi-hats to these 16th note hi-hat grooves. If you're familiar with my first book, A Beginner's Guide, we had a whole lesson chapter on adding open hi-hats to some 8th note grooves. This was lesson 10 of the book. And this is really the first time you start using the hi-hat foot. Within that lesson chapter, we had 4 different scenarios for those open and closed hi-hats. Scenario 1 was closing the hi-hats with a bass drum. In this scenario, both feet would come down together, because when that hi-hat closes and the foot comes down to close that, we're also bringing down the bass drum foot at the same time. The second scenario was opening the hi-hats with a bass drum. This was a little bit trickier because the feet are actually moving in opposite directions. As the bass drum foot goes down, the hi-hat foot needs to lift to open those hi-hats. Scenario 3 was closing the hi-hats with a snare drum. In this scenario, both hands had to come down on the hi-hat and the snare drum as you close the hi-hat with the hi-hat foot. So this wasn't too bad because everything's just falling together. And finally, scenario 4 was opening the hi-hats with a snare drum. Now in the 16th note grooves that we're playing today, we're not actually hitting the hi-hats with a snare drum, so we're not going to be opening the hi-hats with a snare drum because there's no hi-hat to strike. That means for the 16th note hi-hat grooves, we only have 3 scenarios to work through. So let's get started with scenario 1, which is exercise 2.3, and you'll find that on page 21 of Intermediate 1. Closing the hi-hats with a bass drum. In these exercises, the closing part of the movement isn't too bad, because that's going to be a right hand striking the hi-hats as both feet come down together. The tricky element is actually the opening of the hi-hat before this. This is going to be falling on a left hand strike, so that left foot is going to be coming up as the left hand goes down. Something I see a lot when pupils first start trying this scenario is that often the hi-hat starts to open on a right hand strike, even though it's supposed to open on the next left hand strike. So make sure you're not opening the hi-hat too early. In the first example of exercise 2.3, you want to be opening the hi-hat on the ah of 2, not the and of 2. So let's just have a listen to how this first example sounds. Here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so that's the correct way to play it. What you want to avoid is opening the hi-hat too early, which would sound like this. That's actually giving you 2 open hi-hats, which we don't want to do just now. You might want to just try that small section where you're opening the hi-hat and closing it. This can help you get a feel for the movement involved, because all 4 limbs are involved in this. But once you've tried that a few times, let's give the first example a go. You ready? Here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Now all of the 16th note hi-hat grooves that feature in the next 4 different exercises are actually the same grooves that we looked at in exercise 2.1. The only thing we're doing is adding these different open hi-hats for the different scenarios that we just mentioned. And just to save time, I'm not going to run through all of the examples in each of the exercises. We're just going to look at the first one in each of those different boxes. But make sure in your own practice, you're taking the time to try all of the 4 different examples in each different exercise. So be sure to try all of the examples in exercise 2.3 before moving on to exercise 2.4. Which we'll do now, so you may want to pause the audio here. Moving on to the second scenario though, in exercise 2.4, we have opening the hi-hats with a bass drum. Now previously when we looked at this is where we had the feet moving in opposite directions because the hi-hat foot needs to lift up as the bass drum foot needs to go down. That's still going to be the case here, only we're applying it to the 16th note hi-hat pattern. So for these examples, you're going to be closing the hi-hat with a left hand strike. But this isn't too bad because the left hand is going to be coming down as the left foot comes down. Again, you might just want to try that small section of the 2 hits where you're opening with the bass drum and then closing on the next strike. Just getting used to the movement and the mechanics of that particular point of the groove. Once you've done that, let's try the first example of exercise 2.4. Ready? Here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so once again, you might want to pause the audio here to work through the rest of those examples in exercise 2.4. Once you've done that, let's have a look at the next scenario in exercise 2.5, closing the hi-hats with a snare drum. In this scenario, the open hi-hat is going to be falling on a left hand again, but as you've already got used to that from exercise 2.3, that element shouldn't be too bad now. The closing of the hi-hats is falling on a snare drum hit. And this is where you might find it a little bit tricky, because you're going to be closing the hi-hats with that left foot as you strike the snare drum with the right hand. And remember, there's no actual hi-hat strike when you close the hi-hats here. So you might be tempted to hit the hi-hats at this point. Again, maybe practice those 2 hit points of the open hi-hat on the left hand, followed by the snare strike as you close that hi-hat. Give that a couple of runs, make sure you feel comfortable with the movement and the mechanics of it, and then let's give the first example a try. So exercise 2.5, first example, here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Moving on to page 23 of the book, exercise 2.6, we have multiple open hi-hats. Now when we looked at that first scenario, you might have found that your hi-hat wanted to open early instead of on the out of 2. In these examples, we actually want that to be the case, because you don't just have to do a single open hi-hat. You can choose how many open hi-hats you do. In this case, we're going to go with 2 open hi-hats. Now you don't need to close the hi-hats in between these 2 open hits. We're just going to leave the hi-hat open for both strikes and then close it. Within the examples of exercise 2.6, you're going to get all 3 of those scenarios that you've just worked through. So make sure you're comfortable with exercises 2.3 to 2.5 before trying exercise 2.6. The first example in exercise 2.6, we have the scenario of closing the hi-hats with a bass drum. In the second example, we have opening the hi-hats with a bass drum. And then the third example, we have closing the hi-hats with a snare drum. The fourth and last example actually has the hi-hats opening in the middle of the hi-hat pattern, so it's not with a bass drum, you're not closing it with a bass drum or a snare drum, it's just in the middle on its own. Now obviously you could put multiple open hi-hats anywhere within that 16th note hi-hat groove. You might even do 4 open hi-hats, 6 open hi-hats, it's totally up to you. The amount of options is actually quite vast. So I'm only selecting a few examples in exercise 2.6. Feel free to experiment with this as much as you want. Something you could try is just to write out a simple 16th note hi-hat groove and then start by having the hi-hats on the first 2 hits and then move those open hi-hats to hits 2 and 3 or the 1 and a, and then move the hi-hats to the next 2 hits, so 1 e and a, and so on throughout the groove. This is going to give you loads of different options to try. Once all that comes together, you're ready to tackle the next song in the book, which is called the GeeBees. The song itself is actually a lot simpler than some of those exercises you've just tried. My view is that you want to work on the mechanics and the technical elements that you get within the exercises, but when it comes to playing the songs, I don't want to overload you with too much information and too many things to try all at once. So most of the grooves in this piece are actually quite straightforward, and when you do have open hi-hats, they're not all over the place, there's 1 or 2 here and there. The real practice here should be reading the sheet music as you play along to music, and you'll find the backing tracks for this piece with the supporting audio that comes with the book. Let's look at some of the key points in this song. In the intro section, we start with 4 bars, which we actually have as a repeat section. And you'll see at the very beginning, we have the marker, the dynamic marker, MF, mezzo forte. This means medium loud. Once you get to bar 5, we have a snare drum 16th note roll, and we have that crescendo indicator underneath. So we're going from, it says P at the beginning, to MF. This means we're going from soft to medium loud. So often when you get a crescendo, I wouldn't recommend you actually start at that same volume that you're currently playing at. It's much more effective if you drop the volume first and then bring it back up or even increase past the point you previously were. This gives you a much broader sweep of dynamics, which is much more impactful to the listener. Once again, we have these separate endings for the intro section. So as you play through the intro, you're going to play bars 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the second time around, you're going to play bars 1, 2, 3. And at this point, you jump to bar 5 and play that second ending. Moving on to section V, the verse section of this song, we have a crash in there. So that's going to be a new element that you haven't tried yet with these 16th note grooves. Again, you want to make sure that's the same right hand strike that would have been on the hi-hat. So you're going to do a right hand strike crash and then left on the hi-hat. At the end of bar 7, we don't actually have a full sequence of 4E ander. We actually have 4E and. And on the and, you're going to be playing an open hi-hat. It's important that open hi-hat stays open over the space of where the ah would have been. So rather than going 4E and close, like that, on the ah, you're going to be doing 4E and. We're actually going to be closing that on beat 1 of the following bar, where you'll see the plus symbol. At the end of this section in bar 13, we have a simple fill, which is continuing that 16th note pattern. So the snare drum and high tom hits on 3E ander, 4E ander, you're going to continue that same right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left. And that's going to maintain that hand sticking pattern from the groove to the fill and then back into the groove as you move into section C, the chorus. At the start of the chorus, we have that new dynamic indicator, F, which means forte. This means we're going to be upping the volume here because we're going to be playing louder. Forte means loud. We're also moving into a 4 to the floor groove here as we tried earlier. And once again, section C has a repeat with alternate endings. The first ending, marked with a 1 over the top of the groove, which you'll find in bar 17, is just that single bar. Once you've played bar 17, you're going to go back to the start of C, play bars 14, 15, 16, and then jump to the second ending, which is actually 5 bars long. These alternate endings don't have to be the same length as each other. When you do jump to that second ending, we have another dynamic indicator, MF, medium loud. So we're dropping the volume down a touch. And this is actually going to happen quite naturally anyway, because we're not going to be hitting the snare drum in this section very much either. But we do have a couple of moments in these grooves where we're doing a multiple open hi-hat. So let's have a listen to the song full speed with drums. As I mentioned, all the backing tracks are available with the supporting audio for the book, and you can get those at different speeds ranging from 40 BPM all the way up to full speed. So whatever speed you're able to play this, you're actually able to play along with the music as well. See if you can follow the music as you listen to the track. Ready? Here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, I hope you enjoy the sound of that tune. Get stuck into that. If you do still need access to the book, you'll find that on my website, www.ihitdrums.co.uk. It's available as a paperback or an ebook. Subscribe to the website to receive regular updates, and you can also get access to a free groove starter pack if you're a total beginner at the drums. Now, although these episodes are coming out weekly, don't feel like you have to move on from one thing to the next each week. If you need more time to work on something, if you need 2-3 weeks working on this song, that's absolutely fine. Make sure you give each lesson chapter the time it needs for you to develop. Once you've done this, then move on. The episodes will be there whenever you need them. Until next time, enjoy!